This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by two distinguished national security experts, David Shedd, the former acting director and deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Jana Nelson, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Together, we explore emerging security challenges in our own backyard, from Venezuela to the broader Western Hemisphere, and the evolving military and geopolitical tools the United States may employ in response. Stay with us for a wide-ranging conversation with David Shedd and Jana Nelson.
Let's get right into this. And David, let me just ask you here at the outset, from everything you're observing and everyone you're talking to, do you expect the president to initiate military action against Venezuela?
Look, that has already begun. And if we go back to about early September, very late August, we've had 21 strikes against the alleged drug smuggling boats in what is known as Operation Southern Spear. Now, if you want to say land targets are in the offing in terms of what's next, that's entirely possible, whether that's under a legal construct of the armed conflict aspect that is being used to make a case for hitting these drug smuggling boats. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I would not be surprised if that's what comes next in terms of an escalation. We're at an inflection point that backing down by either party, that being the Maduro regime in Caracas, and it's more than Maduro, it's the circle around him that Jana can certainly elaborate on. And the Trump administration, and of course it's more than President Trump, is that we're headed toward some kind of escalation as opposed to the status quo, even though the status quo could hold for a short period of time. But I am quite certain that there are targeting packages on land that have been uploaded and prepared to be executed in terms of kinetic actions inside Venezuela on the orders of the president, if and when that time comes.
So you're in the camp of very possible that we'll maybe you lean yes a little bit that we'll use either bombing, probably not ground troops, but to hit regime targets.
I do. I think that we're not far off from identifying those, whether they're individuals or the labs associated with the Cartel of the Suns, the Cartel de los Soles, or in other narco-related targets inside Venezuela. The question becomes, how close does that get to Miraflores, the proverbial White House version of Caracas, in taking out the leadership as designated individuals? That I'm less certain about, but certainly I think that targets that are associated with the drug trafficking elements inside that include very high senior regime officials as well in terms of their indictments is entirely possible.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a minute on the cartel in Venezuela and on the question of really is this the locus in the hemisphere of cocaine and fentanyl and the other things that the president is worried about. But Jana, let's go to you. You worked at the Department of Defense. You were part of planning military action and likely saw your share of battle plans. What does this firepower set about the entire Caribbean Sea tell you about the president's intentions? Or do you think he's going to go in with additional military action? Or does this feel like maybe we're behind the scenes making a series of diplomatic asks of the Maduro regime with the threat of military force hanging out there?
Yeah, I thank you, Michael, for receiving us, and I have a slightly different view from David. I think what we're seeing here is a variation on a theme. We saw maximum pressure on Venezuela and Trump won. We're seeing maximum pressure again, but military instead of economic. And I do think we're heading to a stalemate. I mean, if this were the invasion, it would be the most transparent yet. We communicate a lot about it every week. And we seem to be playing a long, drawn out game of chicken. The boats will stay there, though, because the national defense strategy is coming out soon, and it will be mostly about focusing on the Western Hemisphere, focusing on homeland defense, diluting our global force posture to cover more territory in the Western Hemisphere. Now, whether or not we're going to do land strikes, we may be prepared for it. I don't doubt that we are. Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hegseth have briefed Republican senators, say that they do not yet have the legal authority to target a sovereign. So while they could do boat strike, which they have recently stopped, the last one was 17 days ago, which is a fair amount of time since this all started. I don't think they are ready, especially with the noise that we're hearing from the boat strikes. In fact, they're ready to do land targets of another country. It would be a declaration of war that perhaps would be a step too far. And it may not be where the president is at either.
Yeah. Okay. I hear you. The legal issues are serious and those would need to be worked through. However, let's just think about Venezuela for a second. If you were part of a process to sort of come up with what a military campaign looked like, what would you hit? Regime targets, cartel labs? I mean, how will this be anything other than a series of bombs coming from airplanes and Aegis destroyers that maybe don't have the effect or the political effect that we want it to, even if it is a spectacular military explosion?
So the targets have been mapped out. This is something that, as per normal, the department is excellent at planning for all scenarios, worst case scenario. And so those targets have been mapped out and have been updated. And if you were to follow through on the legal reasoning that has been presented thus far, that the Maduro regime is the head of a cartel that has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, you would have to most likely justify your targets by attacking narco-trafficking sites. You would try to avoid casualties, especially casualties that are more well-recognized. And therefore, you would go for airstrips. You would go for arms factories, which there is one in Trinidad. And you would go for small military facilities that are used mostly in remote areas of the country.
Well, David, I want to get to you in just a second on the cartel, like I said. But first, do you just assume, I mean, you've been in the high councils of policy throughout the executive branch. Do you assume there's an interlocutor? I know Trump himself talked to Maduro, but someone else who has said to Maduro something to the effect of, listen, you just need to leave your country. We saw a report that he could go to Qatar today, but maybe you can bring your cronies with you and we'll let you take tens of millions of dollars and you get to get away with your life. Is there somebody behind the scenes trying to broker such a deal so that we don't go kinetic?
I think we can all assume that there are certainly channels into Maduro and into his inner circle in terms of interlocutors. Qatar is an interesting one because it's played a role, as we all know, in a number of rapprochement relationships behind the scenes, and this wouldn't be any different if we were using them. I don't know of any U.S. interlocutor that is working behind the scenes, although I would not be surprised if there's an intelligence channel, which is there's a history of doing that. But I would be speculating on that specific point. I do want to go back to Jana's identification of the types of targets. I completely agree with her on that. And I would add that I think the administration is going to find itself in a really difficult place with Executive Order 12333, which is the proverbial Bible of the intelligence community that forbids assassinations. And so the argument that you could take these targets out in terms of the political leadership, including Maduro, I think will come against that kind of backdrop as well. What I do think is that the administration, whether through covert means, and the president himself has acknowledged that there's a covert action program being undertaken by CIA at this time, or whether it's through diplomatic channels, that it's more than likely that there's a way to continue to apply the kind of pressure that we're talking about on the you better leave or else. And it's the or else piece that I think is really interesting in terms of what happens next if Maduro just doubles down and staying in Caracas.
Yeah, that's kind of where I've been for a while, thinking that the president hasn't necessarily set the whole nation up for a sustained bombing campaign of the mainland. And so I assume this was just to really pack a punch behind diplomacy. But David, you were a guest on the podcast NatSec Matters recently, and we went in great detail about the existence of the cartels in Venezuela. Sometimes when I hear people criticize the president's focus on this country, they say, well, you know what? They're not even a major player. It's really about Colombia and Mexico and elsewhere. Can you kind of handicap this for us? Are the cartels very active in Venezuela? And how much are they part of the state, or at least affiliated with certain figures who are at the top of the regime?
Well, starting with the last part of your question and commentary, Michael, they're intricately associated with the inner circle, including Maduro, and there are long indictments that point to that. The issue of Venezuela and drug trafficking is that it's a transit country, mostly for cocaine and mostly to West Africa and to Europe, as opposed to the United States. This again poses a dilemma in making a case on the war related to drug trafficking as the centerpiece in using Venezuela, because it is relatively low in terms of its impact on affecting the cocaine trade into the United States. Now, that said, the capos, the top cartel leaders in Mexico, are the ones that do have the reach, as we well know, into places like Colombia and Venezuela in terms of the trafficking routes. But for example, if you're trying to make Venezuela the case on fentanyl, that has killed tens of thousands of Americans, that really comes out of Mexico, and it comes with the precursors that President Trump himself is addressing vis-a-vis Xi Jinping in Beijing, and not Venezuela. So this isn't to defend at all the counter-drug efforts, but the narrative that's being used by the administration in putting Venezuela front and center of the drug trafficking as it applies to the United States, or its production coming to the United States, is a bit of a long stretch in terms of what the facts actually point to.
Got it. And real quick, before I go back to Jana on these same two questions, give us a 30-second laydown on the Cartel de Sols.
The Cartel de los Soles is a highly integrated cartel inside Venezuela with ties, as I've already said, to the highest levels of the regime. It is a trafficking cartel principally, and it is involved in the transit of the particularly already processed coca leaf, coca to cocaine from Colombia, and under a modus vivendi with the cartel warlords of the cartels in Mexico. And so this is a highly integrated part of the business. So they would have warehouses. They would have infrastructure that could be hit in Venezuela, but essentially they're part of the fabric of the Maduro regime as well, in many aspects.
Jana, you've studied this region even militarily and threat-wise for a long time. Does the president have the right target here? If you, let's just lay aside the legalities, and I know that sounds terrible, but I'm trying to get at this as like a policy matter. So strictly as a policy matter, is this the place you would go first if you felt like you had the president's attention and he wanted to make dramatic progress in terms of our security, either for drugs or migration in the Western Hemisphere?
There's no question that, as you look at the region, one of the main points of destabilization is the regime of Venezuela. It creates insecurity for a number of different reasons. It is the largest refugee migration crisis outside of a war zone. It's a pariah government because he lost last year his election by 37%. So there's a number of reasons why one would want to, quote unquote, solve the Venezuela challenge, right? The issue here is very much the how. The issue at question is how exactly to achieve those means or that end. The broader to this, more than just instability in the region, I mean, there are many reasons why one would want to, or this administration would want to go after Venezuela. I mean, one of them is South Florida politics. And it is important. It matters for the community of both Cuban and Venezuelans that live in Florida and in other parts of the country as well. And Florida is important for political reasons for both President Trump, for Susie Wiles, and for Secretary Rubio. And Maduro is also, in addition to the insecurity and immigration challenge that he has augmented, if not created, Maduro is also kind of at the center of many of the concerns that the Trump administration has, or members of the Trump administration have in the region. Iranian presence in Latin America has to be traced through Venezuela. Chinese influence in Latin America also through Venezuela. The Cuban socialism, the strength of Cuban socialism in the hemisphere also passes through Venezuela. So there are many reasons why the Trump administration would want to target the Maduro regime specifically. And I don't think actually in this particular instance of the what, both parties agree that it is a significant problem that needs to be addressed. The major debate that we're having right now is about the how.
David, I know you talked to the opposition. Let's just say the military, let's say we take kinetic action on the mainland, as you say, and it goes, I don't know, about as well as we could have expected. Can you foresee any kind of scenario where Maduro and his cronies are cast aside? And what exactly does the opposition think? Are they rooting for military action? Like, what do they think is going to happen?
The opposition in general, and you've heard it from the leading voice inside of Venezuela and the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, that she is quite supportive of this campaign of additional pressure. Whether she has personally dissected it to the point that on the legal terms and all of that, that's less clear. Edmundo Gonzalez, the duly elected president of Venezuela, is in exile in Spain today, having won handily, as Jana said, back in July of 2024 in the elections for the president. And he is standing by to return as long as there are, of course, the security assurances. Juan Guaido, who, of course, was the head of the National Assembly and a de facto recognized leader for a couple of or 3 of the years back in the previous decade, is someone who is, of course, prepared to go back. By and large, the opposition is quite united. There are elements, of course, that play into the hands of the Maduro regime. And in that case, sort of are willing to try and find other compromises than a clean cut and removal of the current regime from Caracas. The fundamental question that you're asking, though, Michael, is are they ready? I don't think anyone fully appreciates the depth and breadth of what 1999 to present day, and really the last 15 years under Maduro, the Chavez years being the first decade or so, have meant for Venezuela. And Jana, I know, can elaborate on this in terms of the internal fabric of the military leadership being completely controlled by the Maduro regime. You have to ask yourself, what is their incentive to turn state evidence against Maduro in the inner circle? And I'd say it's a pretty high bar to cross. And secondly, the Cuban intelligence machine has so penetrated and so managed to control the security elements of the Venezuelan regime that this is going to be very, very difficult to dislodge. This is not an overnight land and put up the new flag and you're in and everything turns the next day. This will be a very, very difficult long-term process of transition.
So, Jana, I love military action as much as the next guy, but I thought I'd learned at some point that an air campaign alone likely doesn't achieve a lot on the ground. Is that your, considered view as an expert and as a former DoD policy person?
Yeah, no, certainly agree with that, and agreed very much with David on the day after. Look, the scenario that some would like to see that is being pushed, the idea of targeted strikes from the United States, the military in Venezuela defect, Maduro runs, Maria Corina takes to the streets and is flanked by the people that walk her to Miraflores. That scenario we could see is not a pipe dream. It is possible, right? If we decide to do the target strike, we could see the military defect just out of sheer fear. And then Maduro would have to leave. And Maria Corina would have the capacity to coalesce everybody around her. Obviously, there's a conversation on who actually runs, the government. But, she is the de facto leader of the opposition. And then the bigger issue here is what happens the day after. How much will the United States have to be engaged to ensure the success of a democratic Venezuela, right? So really, it is something that I think the Trump administration is considering. I mean, we've been at this for about 5 months now. The fact that we haven't done something more concrete, I think, is an indication that there is clear concern about becoming embroiled long-term in regime change.
And neither of you predicts any ground activity, right? Other than, we'll ask David about the covert action program in a second. But do either of you anticipate ground activity?
Unlikely.
Very unlikely. The U.S. has, I think, deployed currently in the Caribbean about 15,000 troops. It has the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. None of this is strong enough or powerful enough to conclusively ride into, so to speak, into Caracas. And I don't think there's an appetite by the president to use the proverbial boots on the ground.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more from David Shedd and Jana Nelson.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So, David, I know you talk to people in the administration. What do you think is, I totally think the cartel is motivating the president. I believe that the migration crisis that has arisen from Venezuela's wrecked economy has maybe even been a bigger issue for him. And of course, they're just a cancer in the hemisphere when you consider the, axis of evil states, if you will, that are or upheaval states that are acting down there. But is there anything else that, are there any other things we're overlooking maybe that Secretary Rubio has talked about, or President Trump himself, on why we want to make this one of the signature things that we're going to do in the Western Hem?
I do think that Secretary Rubio is having a heavy role in this, and I think, and I don't want to get into suggesting that this is just a replicate of the Monroe Doctrine, which, for the listeners, is, of course, this being our backyard, our sphere of influence. This is all about our economic interests, but there is an element of that. And you saw within a few weeks, if not days after President Trump assumed office, the issue in Panama and the Panama Canal and the Chinese presence there. And Jana said it so well in terms of this landing point for where the Iranians and Russians and Chinese have a safe haven is clearly in Venezuela. So I think that is another factor as well that's at play here. You've seen it in the rest of the hemisphere in terms of the pushback on the Chinese presence and that. And so there are elements of that, but I do think that domestic politics is a big part of this. As a South Florida resident myself, I can tell you this issue looms big in the Venezuelan community in South Florida, and the politics of it are very real. And with an expectation, now I'm stepping out a bit on a limb, that this would be the first of somewhat of a domino fall then of then Cuba and then Nicaragua and the Ortega regime that I broke my teeth in on in the 1980s with Daniel Ortega and the counter-Sandinista regime at that time. And so I think there is an expectation that this would have a domino effect as well.
Gotcha. Jana, anything to add on that point?
No, 100% agree.
Okay. Could one of you or both of you please tackle the question of the likelihood of regional conflict spreading into Colombia and or Mexico, targeting narco-terrorist organizations?
So I'll jump in briefly. We saw boat strikes off the coast of Acapulco, and the response from President Sheinbaum was very clear. She called in the ambassador, spoke to Secretary Rubio about this. It is not something that she is willing to accept, and made it and asked the U.S. government that if they had identified further boats, that she would take care of it themselves. She just needed the information, the intelligence, so she can act on it. And I think that was in September 2nd. That is perhaps, if not the only, certainly one of the reasons we haven't seen boat strikes since. I don't expect, given the legal considerations, that there would be any strikes on territory in Mexico or Colombia without the authorization of the leaders themselves. I mean, the reality is we do have a narcoterrorism problem in the region. We do have a drug trafficking problem in the region. It is not about the criminal aspect of this. It's about the state capture of these narco entities that are taking over many parts of the state, both in Mexico and Colombia. So these leaders are rightfully concerned, probably President Sheinbaum more than President Petro. And I could see a world in which they would want to collaborate more aggressively with the United States. But I don't see a world in which the United States would start land attacks in either of those countries without the authorization of the leaders.
I would only add to that question. It's a well-defined question in terms of the expansion of potential war or certainly military actions outside the borders of Venezuela and having that spill over. Even in the regimes that have been critical of the Trump administration vis-a-vis the Maduro regime, like President Lula in Brazil, even Petro in Bogota, is that Maduro's fan club is very small to non-existent. In other words, for all the reasons we've already said, there's immigration issues in each of these countries. It's having a certainly, if not a decisive, a high impact in the runoff in Chile, in which an assassination of a lieutenant, Venezuelan lieutenant, occurred under the Boric government there. And even Boric, who's clearly center-left, has had ample time to be critical of the Maduro regime. So the idea of this spreading, if the U.S. hits land targets inside Venezuela, to something beyond that, to what already Jana said in terms of having that expand by the U.S. into both Colombia and into Mexico, is highly unlikely. That said, I don't think that we can say that for the next 3 years, the administration won't entertain that if there isn't a substantial fall or drop in the narco trafficking coming out of both those places as well. But I don't think it's tied to what happens in Venezuela right now.
So just before we get back to these questions, drill down on our relationship with Mexico. David, I think I've heard you say before that Claudia Sheinbaum and President Trump are getting along very well. They're having regular dialogue, certainly on trade matters, but it sounds like after what Jana said that they are at least cooperating, at least talking on security matters too. Is that fair?
Yeah, and remind the audience that Secretary Rubio went there probably 6 weeks ago and kicked off, or certainly built on, the security cooperation. There are a number of extraditions that are occurring from Mexico of these narco traffickers into the U.S. criminal system, and we know that there is ample opportunities for cooperation. It appears that that's working pretty well. The challenge for President Sheinbaum, however, is that I would assume she gets up every day wondering if the target moves on her in terms of what the requirements are from Washington. And for that reason, I think she has to watch herself very carefully. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico trade framework, which used to be NAFTA, now is USMCA, is going to be reopened early this coming year in terms of negotiations. Mexico needs the USMCA in a major way in terms of the economic well-being of the country and its growth potential and its foreign direct investment that it requires. And you even see that in Mexico and the steps that she's taken in setting up a form of the CFIUS process to review Chinese investment in Mexico and all of that. So there's this inextricable link between economics, finance, and economic growth for Mexico to this issue associated with the cartels and organized crime, if you will, pertaining to Mexico. But with some challenges on her part to know if she's ever meeting the mark on something that could be perceived as moving targets or moving goalposts in terms of what she's trying to do.
Jana, David addressed some of this earlier. Let me put this to you. Are President Trump's recent actions more consistent with targeting drug flows into the U.S. or curbing the spread of socialism in the Western Hemisphere?
I think it's mostly focused on, obviously there is a significant concern about the narco trafficking effects, the insecurity effects of narco trafficking in the hemisphere that may affect homeland, right? So that's why the National Defense Strategy is pivoting more towards homeland defense. There's obviously an immigration concern related to narco trafficking. But it feels at this stage, and given what we know about the Trump administration and the first administration, it feels like the concern is very specific to Maduro himself. We have not heard from President Trump much about Cuba. Secretary Rubio is obviously interested in Cuba, but we have not heard from President Trump much about Cuba. We haven't heard much or anything at all from President Trump on Nicaragua. He has engaged in a few elections, namely Honduras, over the weekend. But it feels like his principal concern here from a regional standpoint is Venezuela specifically. And that was true in Trump 1 as well. But I do think there's a legitimate concern in the administration by various members of the administration about the insecurity generated by narco traffickers in the hemisphere.
Got it. Okay. Do you all have any view on the potential for broader sanctions against Venezuela or other regional countries as part of a pressure campaign?
There are more sanctions that can be taken. If you'll recall, earlier in the administration, there was a dissonance between Rick Grenell and Secretary Rubio in which Rick Grinnell was negotiating and opening more lines of access to oil, Venezuelan oil, in particular with Chevron. And so those still stand. Those licenses could be further withdrawn. So there's opportunity there. More importantly, though, I think what is happening that I think will have a more substantial economic effect on Venezuela is that all of these boats in the Caribbean are creating a siege effect. Some are now shadowing the gray naval vessels from Russia that were trafficking in oil. And so that is going to essentially taper down, if not completely shut off, the ability of the Venezuelan regime to continue selling to Turkey and Russia and others their oil.
Gotcha. David, what do you think?
Look, so many sanctions have been placed on Venezuela. I'm not sure there's much left. I do think, as we saw with the OFAC actions against Petro, his wife, his son, that Colombia could come under additional sanctions as a result of the cocaine flow, which is at its highest levels, I believe, in the history of the cocaine production tracking by INL at State Department. And there could be individuals sanctioned in Mexico as another form of doing it, but wholesale sanctions against Mexico would be highly, highly unlikely. And as we've already talked about, the oil piece in Venezuela, it's gone back and forth on that in terms of to drill or not to drill, in terms of the authorization. I think that's on a pause now. I don't think there's anything more that will be done on Venezuela. And I would add that there's nothing that would be more effective now with sanctions directly on the inner circle of Maduro. That those cards have been played.
Got it. What will be the regional reaction to a U.S. attack on Venezuela, particularly from Colombia, Panama, and Mexico?
I'll jump in on that one. I think it will be high in rhetoric and nothing more. A lot of barking, no bite. And the reason I say that, it goes back to my point earlier. There is no one, including the center left in Latin America, and there is a decided shift toward the right, as we saw with Noboa's election in Ecuador as well, and probably Petro after next May will face a center-right president back of, cut from the cloth of Uribe from way back when, is that there's no one there to defend Maduro and the regime. So there will be the rhetoric from Mexico, from perhaps Colombia as well, and Brazil, which was not mentioned in the question. But I think it's really going to be a lot of noise, and they'll just move on from this in terms of the impact. Let's not forget, there are a number, my sources tell me, throughout Latin America, they are very expectant that something's going to happen that really leads to the exit and departure of Maduro, and that would be well received quite independently to the means in which it's done.
Jana, can you also outline just what is China doing in the hemisphere? I see articles about it. Is it just that they want to expand closer to us and the best foothold for them is Venezuela? Is this something we're worried about down the road, or have they already made sort of like, let's call it, tangible moves into this hemisphere that has everyone really upset?
So they've definitely made tangible moves into the hemisphere, and they would love to replicate in the hemisphere what they've done in Africa, which is essentially economic dependency that then gets used as a tool of political influence. And that hasn't happened yet, though the region is increasingly more economic dependent on China. I would say of all the middle economies, with the exception of Mexico, all of them have China as either a number one import or export. So there is general concern and legitimate concern, right? I mean, the next turn of the wheel here is military, and they have been very diligently catering to the military in the hemisphere, inviting them to trips. Brazil very recently, just a few months ago, sent their first general as a military attaché, signaling that they are interested in closer military-to-military relationships. As of now, the U.S. is still the top preferred military partner for every country in the hemisphere, except for the Nicaraguas and Cubas and Venezuelas of this world. But everybody else still sees us as their number one ally, as their number one preferred military partner. They still purchase NATO equipment or NATO adaptable equipment, but eventually this may change. And that has been the effort, I think, for multiple administrations. This is a bipartisan agreement that to avoid that happening, to avoid the region shifting closer to an alliance with China. The more they become economically dependent to the PRC, the more that may happen. So that is also something that we've been concerned about. There's a critical minerals element to this. It plays out both in Brazil and in Peru. We've seen the port of Chancay in Peru. The major reason we're concerned about the port of Chancay is that we, or the Peruvians, nobody really, except for the Chinese, have access to the port. And so that could have dual purpose. It could be used as a military installation as well, if necessary in the future. And then obviously there's just visibility from the skies, right? We have been just expressing concern over the years about Chinese involvement in space observatories in Chile and Argentina, presence in military bases closer to the Antarctic in Argentina. And so all of these things have been all administrations, it's been a bipartisan concern and effort to try to get the region to recognize the deleterious effects of aligning closer to the PRC. And it's certainly a concern. And in the case of just Venezuela and China and Russia, just like we probably wouldn't see major action in the region against Maduro, I agree with David very much so. The region is tired of Maduro, tired of the regime and its instability. We will probably not see China and Russia come to the aid of Maduro. And for China, this is a gift, honestly. If the U.S. does, in fact, attack a sovereign state, for them, it is a wonderful excuse for them to be able to move on Taiwan. For Russia, they're busy elsewhere, so they may not want to come to the aid of Maduro. And they, in fact, have said publicly that they will not. Even though they are helping him by sending more generals, more trainers for their military, but they won't actually get involved in any kinetic action. The Cubans, on the other hand, have been doing everything they can to support the Venezuelans on intelligence.
Let's close on this. David, I know you spend also a lot of time in Mexico. It seems, Jana thinks for sure that Claudia Sheinbaum has taken tangible action to combat the drug cartels there. Certainly, I think I've heard you say before, she's doing a lot more than AMLO did, her predecessor. Other than trade, which, you mentioned we're going to really get moving on USMCA in the not too distant future. How are the relations going between the Trump administration and the Sheinbaum administration? And do you foresee more security cooperation? And what else do you foresee that could make this a great relationship?
Well, I think your audience, and you certainly know, Michael and Jana, that Mexico is as much a domestic U.S. issue as it is a international issue for multiple reasons. And the integration of our economies, but the integration culturally and so forth. And so it really behooves both countries to work hard at making sure that the border issues are properly addressed and that the channels of communication are really transparent and responsive to the needs of security on both sides of the border. So I would call out security cooperation can always be improved. There are issues associated with vetted units and that sort of thing in Mexico associated with my own background that remains challenging but I think improvements can be made there. What you have in President Sheinbaum, in contrast to AMLO, I don't know her personally. I know AMLO from my past, is that he was an old-time politician, smoke-filled rooms, get along to get along, and she is quite different. She is calculating that in her relationship with President Trump, that it needs to be personal. It needs to remain personal. It needs to be so that she can pick up the phone and vice versa. He can pick up the phone and call her, which I'm sure he would have no issue doing, if and when it merits that kind of level of discussion. But I come back to this moving target piece. That's the hardest thing for any other government that is so dependent in the case of trade and the financial integration of our economies, that in the case of Mexico, having these moving targets as to what is expected makes it very difficult to plan. And for Mexico, I think they are bending over backwards. They have a recognition that the cartels are a domestic issue and that the open hands and abrazos and love for the cartel leadership will not work. It has not worked. They have grown in their power, as we've seen recently in the state of Michoacan and the killing of the mayor there, and then the protests that followed. That Mexico and President Sheinbaum and her security elements recognize that this is a big issue, and again, she has to not appease, but she certainly has to address the Morena base that is highly nationalistic and is concerned about the U.S. Overextending its welcome in Mexico in the case of the kinds of activities that would lead to targeting and then hitting those targets from the U.S., which would be absolutely unacceptable and put her in a very difficult position inside. So I think open channels of communication, keep working at all the issues. It's as much a domestic U.S. issue as it is a Mexico issue, and I think you take it day by day and build off of that.
Terrific. Thank you so much, David Shedd, Jana Nelson. We hope to have you back as things develop.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you for having us.
That was David Shedd and Jana Nelson. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To learn more about sponsoring the show, contact us at bgs@bgsdc.com. Join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.